All right, so this is the week 4 recap of the discussion board. So I like to do these videos simply to just highlight essential elements of the discussions. And so these are elements, these are ideas that you've mentioned in your discussion posts, but I want to kind of try to highlight them for you in one place, as opposed to you kind of wading through all the different posts. So again, this week was about more ambiguous cases of egotism. In the previous week, in week 3, we studied cases of radical egotism, cases where literally the only thing that mattered was you. And people could literally be killed if they got in the way of my goals and my desires and my plans. Now, here, we studied 3 cases, Razor Ramon, those people that watched Rock of Ages 20 plus times, and the Newman Shuttle Service. So, what are some highlights of those discussions and those points? So, Razor Ramon. Here we have a guy who was a famous wrestler, and in fact he appeared in the last, what do you call that, WrestleMania. And so, huge guy in the 90s, big, part of their repertoire. And he got addicted to drugs and alcohol and his character. So he became obsessed with and immersed in this character, Razor Ramon. He had a family, a wife and 2 kids, and essentially for large parts of their young lives, he wasn't around. Because of the job that he did, because of his addictions, again, both to drugs, wrestling, and the character, the persona. And so the question is, well, is he wrong? And is he wrong, simply because, what he's doing to his family, or is he wrong even if he didn't have a family? And so here we can say, look, he could be wrong because once you are a father or a mother, you have a responsibility to those children. And if you abandon those children, if you neglect those children, they are left alone, or at least they're left with only one parent, and they're left alone by the person that is supposed to protect them, love them, nurture them, guide them. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be around, every single day or anything like that. Some people have jobs where they travel. But if you're really neglecting them, if you're not there for them, if they don't see you for months, perhaps years, and you're not connected to them in any way, you could say, look, that is a failure of the sacred responsibility of being a parent, and that there is no excuse for that. And if you can't handle that responsibility, maybe you should not be a father or be a mother. Not make that position, not make that choice in the first place. So you can certainly argue that he's wrong there. But other people argued, look, he's also wrong because he was part of this organization, the WWE, and they financed a bunch of treatments for him, and he had an obligation to kind of clean up for this employer that was supporting him. Again, there's something, more important than himself. But if you, the deeper, if you go even deeper and you push further, can you argue that he's wrong simply because of what he's doing to himself, regardless if it hurt his family, regardless if it hurt his WWE employer? Is he wrong because we simply have a responsibility to better ourselves, to excel, to get the most out of our talents? Certainly if you're religious, you could say you have that responsibility to yourself because God created you, and God wants you to get the most out of your talents in your life here. But even if you're not religious or don't take a religious perspective, one could argue that we simply have an obligation to fulfill ourselves and to lead the best kind of lives that we can live. And so in that case, it's not simply I can do whatever I want, but I have a responsibility to better myself. The other kind of issue here is the drugs and the alcoholism. Is he responsible for living the kind of life he did? Or was he a victim of forces that were outside of his control? He came from an alcoholic family. You could argue that, he simply didn't have a lot of choice here. It was simply going to catch up with him. These forces, these desires, these impulses were just too powerful. And I think really the question here, there's 2 questions in terms of ethics that are really pertinent. One is at the outset. Did he fail his moral responsibility because he knew he had this history and he should have done a better job of avoiding these kind of substances in the first place? And that's where he still had control. That's where he had the power to do something different. Others have argued, well, he also had the power when it came to the treatments. If he really wanted to get healthy, and the WWE is financing all these treatments, then he could have done that. If he really wanted it, that's where it could have happened. And one final thing, just because I forgot to mention this in the fatherhood post when I was talking about that. A couple of you mentioned, well, look, he did his job. He made a lot of people happy. He provided financially for his family. They were well off. What more do you expect of him? And in fact, it's selfish for his family to want him around all the time, to take him away from something that he's passionate about, and to maybe perhaps lessen the enjoyment of the WWE experience for many of his fans. So that's an interesting kind of objection, an interesting idea that, look, maybe he did fulfill his obligations. Okay, so that's one case study, and there's, many different elements to it. Another case study is this idea of the Rock of Ages. So these people that see the Rock of Ages 20 plus times. In general, most posts and most students say, look, there's nothing wrong with going to see this. It's what you enjoy. Everybody should have something they're passionate about. Everybody should have some kind of way of a release, something that, is just fun. And you can certainly argue that, look, that's what these people like. They enjoy it. They have fun. Who's to judge? And certainly it's a very valid point in the sense that it is certainly, one can argue that people deserve some R&R. They deserve some time for themselves. They have to recoup. They have to be able to enjoy life, not simply just work, or sacrifice constantly. Okay. So you've got that point. But the issue isn't so much whether you should do something that you enjoy, but whether this was excessive. Whether, they were going kind of overboard. Was it being wasteful? Because you can argue, look, that amount of times, the amount of time that you're spending in the theater, the amount of money that you're spending in the theater, could have been put to better use. That you have an obligation not simply to do what you enjoy, but also to others, and that this is getting self-indulgent. This is excessively, spending time on yourself, on luxury, on just enjoyment. And so that's really the issue. Is this too self-indulgent? Is this too excessive? And if so, where do you draw the line? Maybe you say, okay, 20, it depends, maybe it's over a couple of years. It's not too bad, but, 100 times, how much money is really being spent there? How much time is really being spent there? And if you think that we, as human beings, have obligations to others, that it's not simply about what I want to do, then that's at the point where you have to ask, did they shirk? Did they abandon? Did they not completely fulfill their obligation to others because of how much time they were spending on what they enjoy? Some interesting kind of objections here. You might say, well, look, they supported the theater system and the actors and the attendants and the ushers and everything that goes along with that. So that would certainly be something to consider. The final case study is what very close to home. It's the shuttle service at Newman. And the question is that immoral? Is it immoral because it's a waste of resources? And most of you, the impulse again was to say, no, it's not immoral because of various reasons. Some said, look, we lead hectic lives, we're very busy, tons of things going on, and this is a convenience that is offered to the students in recognition of the hecticness of their lives, and actually is kind of a sign of respect. So that was interesting. Many people also brought up the idea, well, there's certain people that really need that service. Whether you're handicapped, maybe you're disabled, you're elderly. And then the third real defense of it came down to this idea, that in inclement weather, when it's really cold or rainy or things like that, the shuttle provides a real necessary or at least legitimate option for students. Now, I think the question is, okay, how much money are we spending on that shuttle? For the shuttle itself, for its maintenance, for the driver, for the gas. Let's say it's $50,000 a year, just as a kind of a ballpark figure, to run that shuttle continuously. That's the salary or the tuition of 2 students. Should your tuition be increased there to support something which is ultimately a convenience? That's one moral issue. You could also argue, well, does the shuttle, if you're against the shuttle, you can argue that it promotes laziness. That there's no reason that a 20-something-year-old can't walk up and down that Rab Hill and, get some exercise, get out in the fresh air, and so on and so forth. And that if you take the shuttle, you're essentially simply being lazy. That you should be more healthy, that you should exercise, that you should use your body. And by simply using the shuttle, that is not fulfilling that responsibility to yourself. Now, with regard to the disabilities, you could argue, well, maybe it's good for them, for those particular people. But if you're not disabled, do you have an obligation to simply not use the shuttle? And again, so it goes back to the sense of, well, maybe it's convenient for you, but what is its impact on the Newman community as a whole? And with that, that'll wrap up the kind of the recap, and have a great week, and see you next week.